I'll never forget the way the room sounded that evening. It wasn't just laughter, it was the kind that cuts, the kind that leaves a scar. We were all gathered in my parents' living room. It was a Sunday, one of those nights when relatives dropped by with their stories and their judgments. I had been sharing an idea, something small, a plan I'd been working on. Nothing grandiose, nothing that should have sparked ridicule. I spoke with the kind of quiet hope a person has when they finally think they're onto something. And then my cousin leaned back in his chair, smirked, and said it. "You rich, please, you'll never be rich. You can't even keep a decent car running." The others followed. My uncle slapped his knee. My aunt shook her head and whispered to the person beside her, but loud enough for me to hear. My younger brother added fuel with, "Don't waste our time with fantasies." The room erupted. I sat there, heat burning in my chest, forcing myself not to react. It wasn't the first time they had mocked me, but this time it was different because it wasn't behind my back, it was right in front of me. And worse, it was in front of neighbors who had stopped by. People who didn't know me well but who now carried that image of me, the dreamer nobody believed in. I remember gripping the edge of my chair, telling myself not to explode. Arguing would have proved them right. Fighting would have given them another excuse to call me unstable, a failure, so I swallowed it. I sat in silence. But while they laughed, I made a decision. I decided that I would never put myself in that position again, powerless, humiliated, dismissed. I decided I would rise, but not to shove it in their faces. I would rise so that one day when they looked at me, they would know the weight of their words. That night ended the same way most family nights did. They ate, they gossiped, and they left me out of the conversations. I helped clear the plates like I always did, invisible in my own home. But as I washed those dishes, I repeated one sentence in my mind over and over. They will say, not see my anger, not see my revenge, but see the truth. That the one they laughed at was stronger, more patient, and more disciplined than they ever imagined. I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I sat at my desk, staring at the numbers I had been working on. My business plan, my projections. The beginnings of what would later become the foundation of my financial independence. Their words didn't kill my dream, they crystallized it. They gave it edges sharp enough to cut through doubt. That was the night I stopped being just a dreamer. That was the night I became someone with a vow. If you only saw the way they mocked me that night, you might think I had always been the black sheep, the one who never contributed, never tried. But that couldn't be further from the truth. For years, I was the one they lined on. When my parents' heating bill came late in the winter, I was the one who quietly slipped the envelope of cash into the kitchen drawer. When my younger brother needed tuition money to cover his community college fees, I was the one who worked double shifts to make it happen. When my uncle's car broke down on the way to work, I was the one who loaned mine out, even though I needed it just as badly. I wore myself thin, juggling jobs, warehouse nights, diner mornings, construction work on weekends. At one point, I was carrying 2 uniforms in my trunk, changing in between shifts, grabbing a sandwich from the gas station just to keep moving. I told myself I was doing it for family, that belonging, loyalty, and love were worth more than sleep or savings. Every time I reached into my own pocket to cover theirs, I thought, one day they'll see I was there for them. One day they'll know I sacrificed. But sacrifice has a way of disappearing when it's convenient for others. They remembered the one time I couldn't help, the time I had to say no because my rent was due, but they forgot the dozens of times I said yes. They remembered the car I drove, a used one with rust on the wheel wells, but forgot that I didn't have a better one because I'd paid off theirs. That's what made their laughter cut so deeply. It wasn't just the mockery, it was the amnesia. The selective memory that erased every late night, every dollar, every compromise I had made for them. I think that's why humiliation burns so hot, because beneath it lies betrayal. They didn't just call me a failure. They dismissed the years of my life I had poured into making sure they stayed afloat. I used to believe that belonging required giving until it hurt, that if I just kept showing up, kept providing, I'd earn my place at the table. But that night in their laughter, I realized the truth. To them, I was never going to belong in the way I hoped. I was always going to be the one they leaned on without respect, the one they drained without acknowledgement. That's when the question changed. It was no longer, how can I help them? It became, how do I stand on my own, even if it means standing apart? And that shift wasn't just about money, it was about dignity. For so long, I thought dignity was something you could earn by being useful. That if I just worked hard enough, sacrificed long enough, I would finally be valued. But dignity doesn't come from what other people grant you, it comes from what you refuse to surrender. That night showed me I had been surrendering my dignity piece by piece, dollar by dollar, laugh by laugh. And it was time to stop. Quick pause, since I'm sharing my story here, I'd love to know yours. Where are you listening from right now? Drop it in the comments. It always amazes me how many different places these stories travel to. When I look back now, I realize that the price of belonging to my family was never worth the debt it left me with, not financial, but emotional. They thought their words would keep me small. What they didn't realize was that those words gave me clarity. They showed me that real belonging doesn't come from bending until you break. It comes from standing firm, even if you have to stand alone. And from that realization, the next chapter of my life began. It happened on a Saturday evening, the kind of night when the house smelled of food and the voices grew louder with every passing hour. We had visitors, family friends from out of town. They didn't know much about me, only what my relatives chose to share. And that, as usual, wasn't flattering. I had just finished setting the table when my cousin raised his glass and said, half joking, half serious, "Careful what you dream of or you'll end up like him. Always talking, never achieving." The room broke into laughter. My aunt followed with a comment about my old shoes, and my brother chimed in with, "Rich people don't drive cars that stall at stoplights." It was crueler than before, not because the words were sharper, but because they weren't alone this time. Outsiders were there, guests, people who didn't know the sacrifices I had made, who only knew the story my family painted in real time, that I was the butt of the joke. The worst part wasn't the laughter, it was the way my parents stayed silent, no defense, no reminder of what I had done for the family, they just let it happen. Something inside me hardened at that moment. I kept my eyes down, tracing the rim of my glass with my thumb, forcing myself not to flinch. Silence can be a prison, but it can also be a shield. And that night, I used it as both. Because arguing would have given them more ammunition, protesting would have sounded like begging. No, silence was the better choice, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was the kind of silence that writes a vow in stone. While they laughed, I decided I would never again let their words define my worth. I decided I would act, not with shouts, not with fists, not with vengeance, but with patience and precision. They wanted to brand me as a failure in front of strangers. Fine, but one day those strangers would hear a different story. What they didn't know was that I had already been laying the groundwork for something more. I had been studying, planning, saving in small but steady ways. I didn't yet know how the path would unfold, but I knew this. When opportunity arrived, I would be ready to take it. That night I learned that the sharpest revenge isn't loud. It's quiet, it's lawful, it's undeniable. And so I sat there, letting their words wash over me like cold rain, not realizing that rain is what makes roots grow deeper. They thought I was humiliated into silence. But in truth, I was carving out the first step of a vow that would change everything. The only question that remained was how that vow would take shape, how determination, when carried through, would look in real life. That question would haunt me in the weeks to come, And when the answer finally revealed itself, it was nothing any of them could have predicted. After that night, I carried their laughter like a stone in my chest. But stones, if you hold them long enough, become fuel. I went back to work not at my jobs but on myself. And while they thought I was shrinking under the weight of their mockery, I was paying attention. It started with a stray comment. My uncle, the same one who had laughed the loudest, mentioned at a family dinner that his business loan was killing him. He brushed it off with a joke, but his wife's expression told a different story. Tension, fear. I didn't say anything, I just listened. Then I overheard my cousin on the phone, arguing with a credit card company. He thought I wasn't paying attention, but the words minimum payment and collections slipped through the thin walls. And slowly, a pattern revealed itself. For all their arrogance, their laughter, their claims that I would never be rich, they were drowning. Quietly, desperately, beneath the surface they tried to project. Curiosity became research. I started reading about debt, how it worked, how it was sold, how companies bundled it and passed it along like unwanted cargo. What I learned stunned me. Debts, especially defaulted ones, weren't fixed. They were assets that could be bought. At first, it seemed unreal. How could something that chained people down also be traded like a commodity? But the more I read, the clearer it became. Companies offloaded bad debt to cut their losses, and those willing to take on the risk could purchase it, legally, cleanly, quietly. So I asked myself, if strangers could buy these debts, why couldn't I? I didn't rush. This wasn't about impulse. It was about discipline. I combed through public filings, court records, anything I could access without crossing a line. And what I found confirmed my suspicions. Multiple family members were entangled in overdue mortgages, delinquent credit accounts, and loans on the edge of default. The same people who mocked me for not being successful were living on borrowed money they couldn't repay. That discovery didn't make me smile, it made me pause. Because I knew this wasn't just information, it was leverage. And leverage in the right hands can change the balance of power. But I wasn't interested in humiliation for humiliation's sake. No, I wanted something deeper, justice, dignity, proof that silence didn't mean weakness and patience wasn't the same as surrender. So I began making discreet inquiries. No grand announcements, no dramatic reveals, just quiet phone calls, quiet emails, quiet steps toward a possibility none of them would see coming. The irony wasn't lost on me. They believed money was the measure of worth. They believed debt was something to be hidden, shameful. And here I was, learning how the very thing that weighed them down could become the key to my redemption. I wasn't chasing revenge, I was studying balance. And numbers, unlike people, don't lie. And so a new vow began to take shape. Not just to prove them wrong, but to take the very system they ignored, the system they underestimated, and turn it into my shield. The laughter had been their weapons. Now numbers would be mine. And I knew deep down that the next step I took would set in motion a chain of events none of them could undo. The first move came quietly. So quietly that not even I fully realized how much it would change things until the letter was already in the mail. I had done my research carefully. I had spoken with a broker, reviewed the paperwork, studied every line of the law that allowed debts to be bought and sold like merchandise. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't dramatic, it was paperwork signatures, transfer of rights. Cold, technical, boring to anyone else. But to me, it was power taking form. The debt I chose wasn't the biggest. I didn't want to make a reckless leap. Instead, I picked something small enough to manage but large enough to sting. A credit line my cousin had defaulted on months earlier. I remember the moment the deal was finalized. It was almost anticlimactic, an email confirmation, a set of documents stamped and filed. But beneath that simplicity was a truth that made my chest tighten. I now legally controlled something he owed. I didn't send the notice. I didn't put my name on it. That would have been foolish. No, the system had its own way of communicating. A polite letter, formally worded, arrived at his door. It came from the entity I now controlled, not from me directly. Days later, I heard about it. He came storming into the living room, letter in hand, waving it like an accusation. "Can you believe this?" he shouted. "They sold my debt again, some new collectors got it, I swear they're vultures." The others muttered in sympathy, nodding, clucking their tongues. Not one of them suspected. I sat at the far end of the room, silent, sipping my coffee. My heart pounded, but my face gave nothing away. He tossed the letter down on the table and groaned about sharks and bloodsuckers. I wanted to laugh, how strange, to hear him describe me without knowing it, but I didn't. My silence stayed firm. That was the moment the balance began to shift. It wasn't about the money itself. It was about the knowledge. For years, they had laughed freely, confident that I had no weight to throw back, and now, without their awareness, I carried something they couldn't joke away. That night, I sat alone in my room, staring at the copy of the notice. My cousin's name, his obligation, my control. Not to crush him, not to destroy him, but to remind myself that their laughter wasn't the final word. It was a strange feeling, power wrapped in paperwork. I thought it might make me feel vindicated instantly. It didn't. What I felt instead was focus. This was only a beginning. And beginnings require patience. I didn't rush to buy more, I didn't brag, I didn't even allow myself to imagine confrontation yet. Instead, I treated it like planting a seed. One root in the soil, quiet, invisible, but growing. And as that seed took hold, I realized something else. Their laughter had been loud, but it was shallow. Debt, on the other hand, is quiet, but it's heavy. And I was now the one holding the weight. Days turned into weeks. Every so often, I would hear my cousin complain about the new owner of his account. He would curse the system, complain about how unfair it was, joke about disappearing so no one could find him. Meanwhile, I paid my bills on time, saved a little more, prepared for the next step. And with every passing day, the silence between us grew. Not the silence of distance, but the silence of a secret. Because while he laughed less freely now, uneasy about his situation, I carried a truth none of them could see. The first strike had already landed, the first purchase was a seed. It proved to me that the system worked, that silence could be sharper than words. But seeds are meant to grow. And the more I studied, the more I realized how deep the roots of their debts went. My cousin's defaulted credit line was just the surface. Beneath it lay overdue car notes, business loans teetering on collapse, and even a mortgage payment cycle so broken it was hanging by threads. At first, the thought of stepping deeper made me hesitate, because with every move the risk grew, not just financial but personal. Buying one debt was manageable. Buying several meant putting nearly everything I had saved on the line. One misstep, one wrong calculation, and I wouldn't just be proving them right, I would be buried alongside them. But here's the truth: discipline doesn't grow in comfort. It grows in risk, in the spaces where fear whispers loudest. So I made my choice. I started small again, an overdue car loan belonging to my brother. Clean paperwork, another smooth transfer. Then a business loan my uncle had defaulted on, sitting in a bundle of distressed assets. Each time I moved carefully, reading every clause, making sure I stayed well within the bounds of the law. On the outside, my life looked unchanged. I still drove the same car. I still worked my jobs. I still walked into the same family gatherings where they rolled their eyes when I spoke. But beneath the surface, the ledger was rewriting itself. They thought they were secure. They thought their debts were just another burden shuffled from one faceless collector to another. But with each acquisition, that faceless figure was me. The weight of risk pressed hard on me. At night, I'd stare at the ceiling, calculating numbers over and over. What if I couldn't sustain the payments to keep the accounts current? What if the gamble bled me dry? Fear whispered that I was stepping too far. But another voice, a quieter, steadier one, reminded me of that night in the living room. Reminded me of their laughter, their certainty that I would never be more than the punchline. And so I kept moving. The tension began to show on their faces. My uncle complained more often, his jokes sharper, his patience thinner. My cousin grew restless, avoiding eye contact when bills came up in conversation. My brother, usually cocky, grew defensive when anyone teased him about money. I remained silent. I didn't reveal my hand, didn't boast about the power I now held. Instead, I let the system speak for me. Each letter that arrived at their door carried a piece of my quiet resolve. Each notice was another reminder that something was shifting, though they couldn't yet name it. And still, they had no idea. To them, I was the same dreamer they had mocked. They couldn't imagine that the one they dismissed was the same one pulling the strings of their obligations. But I knew the truth: power is rarely loud. It is often calm, steady, invisible until the moment it reveals itself. By the time I had acquired control of the mortgage, the car loan, and the business debt, I understood that I wasn't just holding papers. I was holding choices, their choices. Choices they had made recklessly, choices they thought would never circle back to them in a way they could not ignore. And the irony struck me again. They had laughed at me for never being rich, yet here I was holding the deeds to their struggles. The risk was immense. I won't pretend I slept soundly through those nights, but even in the fear, there was a clarity I had never known before. Because now they weren't the only ones holding my dignity hostage. For the first time, I was holding theirs. One Sunday evening, we all happened to be at my parents' house. The kitchen table was crowded, leftover dishes still warm, half-empty glasses scattered across it. Laughter bounced off the walls, the same kind that once cut into me like a blade. But I wasn't the same person sitting at that table anymore. When the moment quieted, when forks scraped and small talk paused, I slid a neat folder onto the table. No one noticed at first. Then my brother looked down. His voice broke the silence. "What's this?" "Read it," I said softly. He opened the first page and his face drained. A loan statement. His car note, except the creditor wasn't the company he remembered. The name was different. The name was mine. His chair screeched against the floor as he shoved it back. "Oh, you're joking." I shook my head. I don't joke with contracts. The room shifted instantly. Confusion first, then suspicion, then something sharper: fear. My uncle leaned forward, pulling the second page. His business loan, stamped, sealed, transferred. He muttered, half to himself, half to me. "No, this can't be legal." "It's perfectly legal," I replied. "Purchased through proper channels, every signature, every transfer verified." My cousin snatched another document, flipping faster, his hands shaking. "What is this? Some game, some stunt?" "It's no game," I said. My tone stayed calm, almost too calm because I wanted them to hear the difference. The quiet dignity, the certainty. They argued, they raged. My brother shouted that I had betrayed family. My uncle accused me of setting traps. My cousin pleaded that this wasn't fair, that debts were private. But each time I answered with the same steady rhythm. "These are your signatures, these are your choices, these are the contracts you signed." I slid across another stack, mortgage papers this time. The weight of the folder landed like a stone on the table. "Do you see this?" I asked. "The house you sit in right now, the mortgage tied to it rests here, and it no longer belongs to who you think it does." The room went still. No one laughed, no one smirked. I had sat at this same table years ago while they mocked me, while they declared I'd never rise above scraps. And now here we were, the roles inverted. "You wanted me poor," I said evenly. "You told me I'd never be more than a burden. But the truth is, you've been living on borrowed money, borrowed time. And now the lender you answer to is me." My mother's eyes welled, torn between anger and disbelief. "Why would you do this to your own family?" she whispered. "Why?" I leaned forward, folding my hands. "Because family doesn't strip dignity away in front of strangers. Family doesn't laugh when you're bleeding just to feel taller. You made your debts long before I arrived at the table. All I did was take the seat you left empty." No one spoke for a long moment. Finally, my uncle's voice cracked. "What happens now?" That was the question I had waited for, the moment where the dynamic shifted completely. No longer were they judges, mockers, or gatekeepers. Now they were petitioners. I let the silence hang, heavy enough to remind them of the weight they had placed on me all those years. "What happens now," I said slowly, "is up to you. These papers are proof of reality. You owe, I own, that's the present. The future, how we handle it, that depends on whether you've learned anything at all." They had dominated once. Tonight they were dependent, and I didn't need to raise my voice to make it clear. Because the kitchen table had turned into a courtroom and the verdict was already written in ink. The next morning, I didn't call anyone. I didn't post anything online. I simply went about my day, knowing that the first shockwave had already begun. By midweek, whispers reached me. Family friends who had attended that Sunday gathering were calling my relatives, asking about payments, missing debts, and who owned what now. Neighbors stopped by casually, pretending to check on minor things, but all the while sizing up my cousins, my uncle, my brother. The news traveled faster than I anticipated. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very same people who had laughed at me now found themselves questioned, scrutinized, even pitied. At the grocery store, a distant cousin mentioned in passing, "I heard, are they okay with all those notices? Seems messy." My mother only shook her head, avoiding eye contact, while my uncle muttered under his breath whenever anyone mentioned the mortgage. I stayed quiet. I didn't gloat. I didn't revel in their discomfort. There was no satisfaction in shouting, no joy in adding insult to injury. The truth itself was enough. And the truth was this: their laughter had always been louder than their responsibility, and now the roles had reversed. I began noticing subtle changes. My cousin, usually brash and dismissive, now paused when speaking about money, as if measuring each word. My uncle double-checked letters before opening them, scanning for details he hadn't seen before. Even my younger brother, the one who mocked me most, started listening when advice about finances came up. Respect is strange. It doesn't arrive through force. It arrives when people see competence, consistency, and the quiet ability to act. And while some still bristled, some began looking at me differently. A nod here, a cautious smile there, small tokens but unmistakable. Outside the family, the ripple widened. Conversations at local businesses mentioned my name in hushed tones, not with mockery but acknowledgement. They weren't asking how I did it, they were asking how I stayed calm while others faltered. And there it was, the contrast that struck me most. The same people who once ruled the room with laughter and scorn now struggled under the weight of consequence. What had once been public ridicule became public reckoning. Still, I remained deliberate in my restraint. I didn't flaunt ownership. I didn't make public accusations. The ledger spoke for itself. Every notice, every payment, every calculation was documented, lawful, and firm. The results were undeniable, but my role remained almost invisible. Because visibility, when paired with ego, can destroy dignity. Quiet power, however, preserves it. Even as the family adjusted to their new reality, I felt no elation. There was no moment of triumph, no gloating smirk, only awareness. I had done what I set out to do, asserted control, reclaimed dignity, and allowed truth to speak louder than words. And in that awareness came another lesson. The greatest victories aren't announced. They are felt in the shift of energy, in the pause before laughter returns, in the subtle recognition of competence. The house that once echoed with mockery now echoed with something else. Caution, calculation, respect, reluctant but respect nonetheless. For me, it was proof enough that the path I had taken, the slow, quiet, lawful path, was the right one. The weight of responsibility, both theirs and mine, had been acknowledged. And as the news spread, I realized the story wasn't just about debts or money. It was about boundaries, accountability, and the quiet strength that comes from patience and integrity. By the time the dust settled, I could have crushed them. I could have demanded every dollar, applied penalties, or forced the full weight of the law onto their shoulders. But that wasn't the goal. I wanted accountability, not annihilation, so I restructured the debts, fair, manageable terms that required responsibility but didn't strip them of their ability to live. I explained it clearly, calmly, and gave them the space to agree or adjust. No lectures, no gloating, just clarity. And as I watched them process it, the hesitation, the acceptance, the slow understanding, I realized that the most powerful victories are invisible. They don't make noise, they don't seek applause. They quietly transform circumstances and set boundaries that were long overdue. Beyond the numbers, I sought to make a bigger impact. I started a local initiative for financial literacy, helping neighbors, friends, and even distant relatives understand credit, debt, and long-term planning. It wasn't about showing off what I had done to my family. It was about giving back so that no one else would fall into the traps that had trapped them. I often thought about what it would have felt like to take revenge purely for satisfaction, but I knew that cycle would have left me hollow. Growth, not cruelty, became my measure of success. And in that choice, my dignity remained intact. I had stood my ground, defended my worth, and reclaimed my life, not by attacking, but by asserting responsibility and fostering accountability. The contrast was clear. The path of vengeance is loud, bitter, and fleeting. The path of renewal is quiet, deliberate, and enduring. And as I walked through the streets of my community, seeing people empowered by knowledge, seeing neighbors take control of their finances, I understood that the story wasn't really about debts at all. It was about resilience, clarity, and the quiet strength of acting with purpose. I remember the nights of quiet struggle, the early mornings, the exhaustion from juggling jobs while saving every spare dollar. I remember the ridicule, the sneers, the whispered jokes behind my back. I remember the feeling of being underestimated, not by strangers, but by those who were supposed to love and support me most. And yet here I am, not boasting, not flaunting, not seeking applause, just quietly vindicated. The debts are accounted for, the obligations are clear, and I've reclaimed what was always mine, my dignity, my boundaries, and my sense of self-worth. But the story doesn't end there. What I want you to consider, as someone listening to this now, is what you would do if faced with the same circumstances. If you had been mocked, doubted, and dismissed by those closest to you, would you act as I did? Would you reclaim control quietly with law and patience as your weapons? Or would you choose a different path, walk away, forgive, confront differently? There is no simple answer. There is no universal right choice. The moral weight of these decisions lies in our values. Restraint versus impulse, justice versus vengeance, growth versus retaliation. I've learned that restraint doesn't mean weakness. Quiet doesn't mean surrender. Acting decisively, legally, deliberately, without cruelty can be more powerful than the loudest retaliation. And yet, I understand that each of you listening may feel differently. Some may say forgiveness is the only path. Others may say walking away is the truest form of self-respect. Some may even feel they could not have chosen the same patience, the same meticulous strategy. That's the point. This story isn't just about me. It's about choices. It's about the moments we are given, the moments we must decide whether to rise with dignity, retaliate with anger, or simply step aside. It's about the quiet strength that comes from knowing your worth and acting in alignment with your principles, even when it's hard, even when the world doubts you. So here's my final question to you. If you were in my place, would you forgive or walk away, and why? Pause, reflect, and leave your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to hear them, because the value of this story isn't only in the outcome, it's in the conversation it sparks, the reflection it inspires, and the way it challenges each of us to consider what we would do when faced with mockery, betrayal, and the chance to take control of our own lives. The laughter that once defined me is gone. The debts, the choices, the quiet victories, they remain. And in them lies the lesson: restraint, integrity, and deliberate action can rewrite any story if we have the patience and courage to carry it through.